the Labour Party is, as we mentioned on the Daily Objective, now in government. That's the sad news of the day. The good news of the day is that the Conservative Party had justice brought to them, and they are no longer in government. This is a good thing considering the things that they did when they were in government. So today we're paraphrasing Ayn Rand's the title of Ayn Rand essay, Conservatism and Obituary, and we are talking. This is our verbal obituary for the Conservative Party, and you know they're not gone completely. We'll talk about that a little bit, but yeah, the many of the people responsible for the left-wing policies, if you want to put it that way, of the past 14 years are no longer in power, and we have other people about to implement some other left-wing policies. I'm joined by Morgan, Marco, Richard. Richard, I'll start with you.
Okay, fair enough. Well, the first thing I wanted to highlight, which in relation to this election, was the turnout, because I think that's really telling as to why the Conservatives have just been flushed down the toilet. Because essentially, this is the second lowest turnout since 1885. Now, because the turnout was just 60%, and in many seats were decided by only half the electorate. So, I mean, the lowest turnout was in 2001, back when Morgan was a toddler, when it was 59%. So basically, we're talking, this is an appallingly low turnout. Lots of people stayed at home and chose not to turn out. Now, not necessarily for the reasons that Razi's given for not voting in the past. Now, a lot of that would be for other reasons. That would be for general apathy, some of them apathetic about their own lives. So some of them will be because there wasn't a Marxist enough candidate on the ballot. And some of them for rational reasons, perhaps that they didn't feel any of them represented them and chose, like Razi, not to vote. So that's one of the most crucial things to mention, I think. One of the things I wanted to focus on was the system that we've got, because it really does reflect a quite shocking, in a sense, a lack of democracy, to be honest, because let's look at Labour for a second, because if you imagine 5 years ago, Labour got their worst result since 1935 under Jeremy Corbyn, right? And now they've got a 174 seat majority this time round. And what's their vote gone up by? It's gone up by a staggering, wait for it, 2%. Basically the same amount of people voted for Labour this time and getting a massive majority as voted for last time and got the worst results since 1935. What's happened is not with Labour, it's with the Conservatives. It's with the Conservatives, all the voters either going to other parties or staying away, and their vote share has gone down massively. And that is the real story of this election. That's why it is an obituary, although it is by many measures not a satisfying enough death, to be honest. And I'd hoped for some more losses from them to really rub home the message. But it is significant, certainly. Good 200 seat loss, well over 200 seat loss. So that's my opening remarks anyway.
Yes, it's an obituary, but it's not a murder. It's not death of old age. It's just, they're not very well. Unfortunately, they're still around. 23% of the electorate still voted for them. And to be honest, we were hoping for a proper bloodbath, for a proper wiping out of the Conservatives, and it didn't happen. Partially because the big beasts, the senior figures, the coward that they were, they resigned, so they didn't want to stand up because they didn't want to do a Portillo moment, which happened in 1997 when the guy was seen as the heir to Thatcher, lost his seat, and that was a humiliating defeat that effectively condemned the Tories for the next 10, 15 years into opposition. But again, if this is a terrible result for the Tories, again, not terrible enough, it's all their own fault. It's not like the Labour Party is particularly astute politically. It's not that the policies are any good. It's not that the politicians themselves are very good. It's the same old tired faces that really bored us to death until 2010, who have just come back from, got out of their fridges, wherever they were holding themselves. Part of the tragedy is that some of the big people from the Tory party have been kicked upstairs, have received a peerage. So we're never going to get rid of them because peers in the House of Lords are around forever. One of these people is Theresa May, one of the greatest guilty party for destroying the Conservative Party. But frankly, I wouldn't have awarded her with a peerage. I would just given her a one-way ticket to Australia or somewhere, and never let her in the country. But that's my just opinion. So just to recap, as Richard mentioned, it's not a success story for Labour. It's just a disaster story that the Tories have done out of their own inability to govern or to organize a peace up in a brewery.
I guess, I mean, just until Rousey comes back, I'll say I'm finding it hard to interpret exactly what it is that's caused people to give this result to the Conservatives. Not in the sense that I obviously know people don't like the Conservatives, but is this a judgment on the last 14 years of the Conservatives being in power, or is this a judgment of the last 5 years? Because some people in the campaign were saying the Conservatives are going to go out because of austerity and this kind of thing, which is, of course, the policy being pursued by David Cameron when he was in office. But actually, it would be hard to make that the real justification for why they've done so poorly, given that although they did badly at the 2017 election, they still enough people voted for them that they managed to hang on. And then in 2019, of course, they win a fairly big majority. So I think probably we'd have to look at the last 5 years to explain why the Conservatives have lost quite as poorly as they have. Probably it's a judgment, one, on Boris Johnson and the kind of Partygate scandals and all the other broader scandals that have gone on. Liz Truss's performance while she was in office, and then basically Rishi Sunak hasn't been able to pull that back in the last 18 months, something like that. And although I'm not as wanting to be as soft on him as some people I know would like to be, I think to be fair to him, I see that I don't think there's any way he could do that. I think that's just an impossible task. I think that resentment towards the Conservative Party is just so entrenched by that point. I don't know how he could do it. So I think probably it's the last 5 years that have really put the nail in the coffin for the Conservatives.
Well, so if I can add to that one, Rishi Sunak was Chancellor of the Exchequer when money was thrown left, right, and centre during the COVID times. So it's totally squarely at his door, the fault for the Conservative performance. And the fact that he was the guy that nobody in the party wanted when there was a contest between Liz Truss and him, who was among the runners, the fact they didn't vote for him kind of seals the coffin for people, really. And then again, the voters or the Conservatives, they're conservatives. So traditionally they vote Conservatives, partially because they always do that, but partially because they got some entrenched advantage in doing that. They got some motivation, which is not necessarily ideological. Most of the time is a very practical, pragmatic reason to vote Tories, which is exactly what happens with the core Labour Party. They like to get their handouts, they like to get the benefits, so they would never rock the boat to that extent. And that's why the percentage, 34% that the Labour got, is roughly the same percentage they got in 2019 where things went so wrong. And the core 24% of the Conservatives is unshakable, really. Is the people whose life depend on being conservative? It's very hard to shake off, and that's unfortunately is as high as that because too many people have got too much interest in keeping this circus alive.
Yeah. By the way, I can't see the chat, so somebody else will have to read it. I'm using my phone at least until the internet comes back here. I'm not going to make another joke about we're living under a Labor government. It's the second show, and look at all the technical difficulties since. Anyway, yeah, Marco, that nobody wanted Rishi to be prime minister thing isn't exactly true. the membership of the Conservative Party voted for Liz Truss. But some people did. Career politicians wanted him to be the leader, and when the people voted the wrong way, they got rid of the person that the people voted for and put him instead. So some people did. But the thing is, you're talking about lockdowns, and I remember in the first lockdown when they started easing some things in the summer, and they were allowing people to go out, but you had to socially distance. They allowed some restaurants to open. They had this thing called Eat Out to Help Out, which was basically you go to a restaurant and like you get 50% back from the government up to 10 pounds. So if you spend 20 pounds, you get 50%. If you spend more than that, you get 10 pounds, no matter how much you spend. And there were like signs outside restaurants saying, "Thanks, Rishi." Uh, so he had fans for a while. Now, they thanked him kind of short term, which is very, by the way, it's ridiculous on every level. First of all, they forced you to close your business down. Then they give you money that ultimately you're going to have to pay for one way or another, and then we got the economy that you get when government pays you to eat at restaurants. I'm thinking about when I moved to this country in September of 2008, and when the whole world was collapsing economically, and Gordon Brown was prime minister, and Gordon Brown, of course, was one of those Labour prime ministers who was never elected. Tony Blair was elected, and then he left, and he gave Gordon Brown a couple of years to run the country into the ground before he goes to the people. And yeah, at the time, like one of the things that they did was to raise the highest level of income tax from 40% to 50% as a emergency temporary measure for a year. And then the conservative government, I think, extended it by another year or so, and then they cut it, or maybe they didn't. Eventually, they cut it. It was raised from 40 to 50. They cut it to 45. So in effect, raising taxes, because if it's an emergency measure for a year, after the year you go back to the 40%. That's not what happened. They put it back at 45 permanently. So that was a tax hike, which of course was spinned by the media as a tax cut. And that was one of the first of, again, many policies that the conservatives had, where they really moved this country economically more in the direction of government control, more of your money being taken up by the government and spent however they see right, more of government telling you how to run your business, how to run your life. So I think, Morgan, you're probably right that the last 5 years, this is what people remember, but this country has been run slowly into the ground by the Conservative Party that has now finally lost power.
I mean, yes, I think they've done lots of bad things. I think for people who think the Conservative Party are the last bastion of free markets or anything like that, they certainly haven't done that. They've kind of tried to walk this kind of middle path where broadly they're kind of bringing down the budget deficit, and they're trying, thinking they're being very responsible with the economy, but actually they largely haven't really revolutionized things away from the way Tony Blair did things. So yeah, we're still in this kind of mediocre space where we aren't performing very well, but we aren't kind of, quite falling off the edge of a cliff. We're just managing to trundle along by. So I think that's probably true. But just the fact that the 2019 election result returned a majority for the Conservatives, just I think means we have to look to the recent years to explain why people are quite so angry with them. And you okay, Reza?
Yeah. Yeah, but Morgan, do you want to moderate from now on, at least while I'm on my phone, because it's
Sure.
a bit more complicated. Yeah, thanks.
Okay. Marco, Richard, what do you guys think?
Yeah. I mean, when you talk about Rishi Sunak, he literally sprayed money from a cannon around during the COVID period. There was the furlough scheme, which was his scheme for paying people, and whether people had jobs or whether they had their own private companies. There was no checks on anything. So the amount of fraud was colossal, and tens of billions of pounds was just handed out to God knows who, God knows how, and is never going to be traced back again, never going to be sought back. And people were free for all for grabbing the money. They had like billions of pounds wasted on PPE, on protective gear for hospitals. There was like 1.3 billion pounds worth of hospital gowns and rubber gloves was found in a forest that had literally never been used, but have been paid for by all of us, and will be paid for. It cost even more with the debt that it was paid for with. So there was nothing conservative about Rishi Sunak. Of course, people like the BBC loved it. They loved the fact that that this Tory government that came in on a Brexit vote was now bankrupting the country, was now wasting lots of money, wasting all its opportunity to do things by handing out money left, right, and centre. That's why I'm sure the BBC and together with the Labour Party were arguing for longer and more lockdowns, so that the Tory party could continue to blow off its own feet with a shotgun. All of that was at play, and they were lousy political operators, lousy policy operators. The policies they came up with were atrocious, such as the Rwanda scheme, which was risible even among their own ranks, and nobody believed they believed it, let alone anybody else. So, just the sheer PR part of it, even if you take politics as a shameful game for trying to pull the wool over people's eyes, they weren't even very good at that. You look at even the election announcement in the pouring rain was just a testament to Rishi Sunak's time in office and the last few years of various Tory governments. So all of it was just desserts. I think the fact that, as Marco mentioned, that you still had 23-24% voting Conservative, I find deeply depressing that it's still as high as that, because some of that is tradition. Some of that is tribalism. We always vote for the blue party, it being blue in the UK for the Conservatives, and some of it is, as Marco said, a vested interest in the system as it is, and doing it for those kind of reasons. And some of it is a bit of cowardice, to be honest. And it's a bit of the fact that people have been scared by the other lot are going to raise taxes or cling to nurse for fear of something worse, because Labour's going to be worse. So you better stick with us, even though we're dreadful. All of those arguments seem to cut through a little bit, a few percentage more than I would have hoped for. And that's why, there's still a hand clawing out of the grave that they've been buried in this election. So they're not quite dead yet.
Yeah, unfortunately, at best they are zombies. But again, it's more to continue the simile. It's more like they are wounded because they're nowhere near being dead. Unfortunately, these guys will be around forever. Just the fact that the former Chancellor Jeremy Hunt managed to scrape through, and that in itself is so depressing. The guy who was in charge of increasing taxation and do all sorts of stupid stuff on behalf of Rishi Sunak. I mean, that's depressing itself. But to be honest, personally, the thing that is really unforgivable from the Tories is this kind of managed decline that they've been pushing for certainly last 5 years. And during the election itself, they missed the opportunity of trying to put across a positive spin, a positive message. There's so much to be happy about the future. There's so much you could have done. There's so much you could do. Just look, for example, of the Australian, UK, US, the AUKUS defense agreement. That was a massive vote towards let's collaborate with people who are our allies. You could have gone down that route. You could have proposed more collaboration, more opening to the rest of the world. But no, instead they decide to make the focus, the other guys might win more seats, so we must fight them. It was just a damaging invitation from the very beginning. And that's why they deserve to lose. But I think the real happy people today are the civil servants. Just look at the scenes of jubilation from civil service when the failed bureaucrats, Kier Starmer, went in. Of course, they're the same people who were trying to bring down the government all the time. It's not a surprise that it's not a coincidence that the person who was in charge of investigating Boris Johnson's so-called parties in Number 10 during the lockdown period ended up being a chief of staff for Kier Starmer, Sue Gray. She was a civil servant in charge of doing a witch hunt on behalf of the Labour Party. I think her son stood up as a candidate as well. And this is again the Labour Party who's calling for bigger, longer, harder lockdowns and more handouts. So, the happy news is that the net zero, the NHS worship, the two-state solution, the welfare expenditure, rejoin the EU and all this kind of stuff, throwing lots of money to the EU, is safely as safe is the hand of Labour as it was in the Tories. So all these policies are not going to change anytime soon. So really, who cares?
Well, I mean, you guys were pointing out that they still managed to get 20-something% of the vote. And I agree that in a way, given just how much resentment there is, that feels a bit surprising. But there is this kind of inertia around people where they seem to vote Conservative. And so if we were in a proportional system, they would presumably have something like 200 seats or something like that. Oh no, actually, maybe they would still have roughly what they have right now. Actually, if we were in a proportional system.
Well, actually, I've got some figures on that, which I think, sorry to butt in, but I think it's quite telling, particularly when you compare some of the parties together. So the Tories got 24%, as we just mentioned. If that was on a percentage basis, or rather, let's look at it this way: the percentage of the seats they got was 19%. But one of the biggest contrasts is this one. So Labour got 34%, but they get 64% of the seats. And then when you look at Reform, this is where it's deeply telling. Reform got 14% of the vote, and that translated into 1% of the seats. And that really shows the difference. And I think, and we may come on to Reform in a minute, but and if you look at a comparison between Reform and the Liberal Democrats, Reform had like 4 million votes and have got they've just picked up a fifth seat. They've got 5 seats, whereas the Liberal Democrats had 500,000 less than them, but managed to get 71 seats. So this is just to do with the concentration of votes within certain areas, and the fact that those votes were sometimes tactical in order to get rid of the Tory candidates, and sometimes it's just because of the demographics of where people live and how they pile up, whereas the Reform one was more universally spread across the country, although in different weightings.
Sure. Sorry, just continue the theme of proportionality in now very screwed up system. 500,000 people who represent the 2% of the electorate, resulting into 6 independent candidates. One is in Northern Ireland, the other 5 are jihadi parties. 4 are Muslim, openly Muslim, supported by a Muslim Vote website. The other one is Corbyn, so it's as good as. So even that weirdness, 2% of the independent generates 6 seats, while even the 14% of Reform generates only the 5 seats. That in itself is quite disturbing. But what's more disturbing that this situation has been created by 14 years of Tories. They allowed the sectarian vote to actually come out of the woodwork, and now we're in this situation where we'll have to face it in the future. This is going to be more and more of a problem. And even there's nothing to cheer about the 4 Green seats or the Lib Dem seats, because again the Muslim Vote was suggesting often voting Lib Dem or Green in order to get rid of the undesirable candidates which were against the Palestine cause.
Based on how they voted in certain votes in Parliament, they made this advice as to whether people voted for or against recognizing a Palestinian state.
Sure. And maybe we should come to Reform in just a sec, because although they didn't get a huge number of seats. They were a major kind of thing at this election. But I'll just answer some of the super chats we've got. So £5 from PC, who asked, did any of Galloway's woke party get seats? I think woke is almost a bit of a soft term for Galloway's party. I think they're much worse than that descriptor. I think what I saw was no, they didn't. They didn't get a single seat, I don't think, which is very good. In fact, Galloway lost his seat, and so he was MP for what, about 4 months, something like that. And that's a very good thing. He didn't even actually turn up to his count where they announced the result. The BBC found him in a hotel lobby somewhere, looking a bit dishevelled, maybe even a bit drunk was how he looked, just kind of slung over the chair, watching it come in. I think probably knowing he wasn't going to win, and he looked rather depressed. And that's good for us. George Galloway not being in the House of Commons, very, very good thing.
I think he gets £21,000 for the fact he was an MP, even if it's for 10 minutes, as a severance pay. But
Okay.
hey,
Yeah,
that's nothing.
Like a one-time payment or a regular. Oh, that's not that bad. I mean, just because in Israel you get a pension for life.
Imagine how many rockets for Hamas to 21,000 buys.
Yes, it's not as bad as all that those hospital gowns sitting in the woods, but yes.
So then Equal Reality gives £5. Oh, sorry, Razi.
No, continue and then.
Okay. Equal Reality gives £5 and says the only difference between Tories and Labour is Tories are first gear and Labour is sixth, with NOS active. Kind of. I know why people say that. People kind of say they're all the same. Certainly, the Conservatives, I think the managed decline description that you gave, Marco, I think that's quite accurate. And I don't know what do you guys think about Kier Starmer? Do you think he's going to really swing to the left now? Because I think, as I mentioned on the Daily Objective, the interesting thing from his speech when he spoke outside 10 Downing Street was he said that we will be unburdened by doctrine, which presumably is him posting himself to the centre ground. How do you guys think he'll try and appease the left now, or do you think he'll kind of try and stay in the centre?
I think that's him posting himself to the wind, because I think he's likely to be buffeted around by the various elements pulling him in different directions within his party, whether that's the Muslim voters that did stick with Labour, who maybe only stuck with Labour on the case of promises for recognising a Palestine state, for example, or whether it's those that want more union power. I mean, you've got to bear in mind there's quite a bit within his manifesto which is actually pretty damn left wing, including setting up a British energy company, essentially nationalising the rail over time as contracts expire. So there's quite a bit in there that's already, certainly, socialist. So it depends how much he's buffeted about by events and by the various factions within their own party, including its full wings. Now, having a 174 seat majority is going to allow him to ignore some of those to some extent, but depends, doesn't it? So we will find out soon enough.
Kier Starmer hasn't got a single principle in his panoply of pointless weapons. I mean, he's been changing policies left, right, and center. Sometimes he turns so many times I don't even know if he knows which way he's pointing anymore. Just look at the the way they managed the seat for Diane Abbott. Until the very last minute, they didn't even know if she would have been a candidate because she's a Corbyn babe. So they would have loved to get rid of her, but at the last minute, a cock-up meant that she was still on the ballot for Labour. Kier Starmer is the guy who was on his knees during the BLM riots. Kier Starmer is the guy who was fighting against the referendum and at the same time trying to tell the people who voted for Brexit that he's the guy that doesn't care anymore about the EU. This guy really is going to be open to any kind of pressure comes his way. He's the guy who was in favor of Israel until the Muslim barked at him, so he decided to go for a ceasefire. I mean, honestly, it's going to be hilarious to see him try and negotiate all the various currents within his party. And I don't think he's going to stand up to them at all. He hasn't got any spine.
An interesting thing people noticed was the larger the percentage of Muslims in an area, the higher they were as a percentage of the population, actually the worse Labour did. So they seem to have punished Labour very much over Gaza. They obviously wanted Labour to be much more forthright on that, and that Labour suffered there, although that didn't translate very much into the seats they got. And then just our final super chat, Alexis Yanaku gives £10 and says, should the Tories ally with reform? Now, maybe I'll come to Rousey first for that one.
I don't know if I care. So, I mean, I really despise the Tories so much that even with the favorite to become leader, Kemi Badenoch, she is one of the better ones. I don't know. I mean, to me, reform is very problematic because of their immigration policy. Uh, so yeah, I don't know. It's something we brought up in the Daily Objective. It's a possibility. Politically, it might be a good idea, or at least a good idea for the next election to have them run in different places so that they can form some sort of a coalition, rather than split the vote so that Labour can win with a third of the vote, a massive majority. But yeah, I mean that's a question that if you ask politically, maybe. If you ask, am I eager to vote for a party that's made up of reform and the Tories? No. But I had a few other things that I wanted to say. So by the way, there are things you can only hear on the Ayn Rand Center UK, like Diane Abbott being called a babe. That is an absolute first, I am sure, anywhere in the world. There was some talk about, Richard, was it you who mentioned Rwanda?
It was. Can I just mention that Diane Abbott used to go out with Jeremy Corbyn, so she's a babe in that sense as well. But you can keep that imagery for your
I
private
don't think
time.
that's the definition of babe, is someone who goes out with.
It's just because all the women, just to tell you how much times have changed. In 97, all the women were called Tony's babes. Tony's, the contingent of women MP that were elected under Tony Blair. So
It's a reference
Yeah.
to that.
I remember the 90s. It was a nicer time. So anyway, yeah. So Rwanda, Richard, you mentioned that besides it being a terrible idea, it was also bad PR. And I think maybe the way, if they wanted to go ahead with it, the way just based on how other topics are being discussed, maybe the way to sell it would have been that we're keeping Britain for the indigenous people and sending non-indigenous people back to Africa, although it's not all non-indigenous, because that certainly works for the pro-Hamas side. Back to lockdowns. So, the Tory party obviously didn't create the crisis, because there would have been a crisis. There was a pandemic. It would have been a crisis anyway. There would have been economic hardships. People would not have gone to restaurants. Would not have filled them up, even if there was no lockdown. But the Tories definitely helped further it along and helped double down on it. And it was especially bad considering Britain was like one of the last countries to go into lockdown, because Boris said, no, we're going to flatten the curve, or whatever he was saying. We're gonna so we're gonna keep everything open, and then he completely changed his mind. We had one of the worst lockdowns of any Western country. And I remember, I think it was in the Independent, a title of an op-ed saying, we're living in Jeremy Corbyn's Britain now, which I thought was very true. And it not only said what it said essentially what the conservatives think about how things that are important should be handled. And if it's something really important, if not, we can play around with the free market. But if there's a really big deal, we can't handle freedom. We can't have people making decisions about their own lives. Remember, like, if you decide to go out and somebody else decides to go out, you are the people who have done the risk assessment and chosen to go out. And there's a pandemic. There was nobody advocating for a law forcing everybody to go out. So, but yeah, so the Tories have really done everything they could to make sure they're not really different in any substantial way from Labour. And so, why not vote for the original? Having said that, I think I'm going to be able to get back on my laptop, so I will be leaving this for a few more minutes, and you guys continue. I'll see you soon.
Marco, Richard, what do you think about whether the Tories should ally with reform?
I'd like to say just one word: Sweden. The Tories, the Swedes had the same pandemic that we had. yet they, despite being notoriously more lefty than we are, they chose to go down a different route. So I can't even forgive the Tories for the way they handled the pandemic by saying, well, it just happened to them, they couldn't do anything about it, because they could have done a lot about it, and they chose not to do it. Initially, Boris Johnson, again, a guy who doesn't know a principle if it's in the face, but had this instinct of letting it, go through the population. But then he got swayed by the technocrats and the various bureaucrats. So we went down the route of lockdowns. Admittedly, it was a British lockdown, i.e., you could get away with whatever you wanted. It wasn't really, really a lockdown like France or the Italian one or the Austrian one. They were terrible about it. But yeah, it was still a choice. So
Yeah, I'll get to the super chat in a minute that you mentioned, Alexa's super chat there. Just on that last point, though, I just wanted to mention that one of the reasons that they, I mean, they had 3 lockdowns. We had 3 lockdowns in the UK, and they were, you know, they were all unnecessary in my view, for sure. And one of the things early on that was spoken about was that we might have to concentrate on the older population and essentially having an older person's lockdown. So for the vulnerable or people of a certain age, that it would be in their best interest that they didn't go out. And perhaps if you were over 70 or 75, that might be the initial rule. There was some talk about that in the beginning. But of course, because of being sold into an inequality agenda and that it would be too mean to focus on just the old people, we decided to make it a rule for everyone equally. So nobody can go out, at least in theory. And of course, Marco's reference there to the fact that it was a lockdown, but also not a lockdown, and you could wear a mask, but you could say I'm exempt and therefore not wear a mask. All of that helped destroy a notion of what the law is and that it should be followed, and made a mockery of the law and of rules generally, which means that subsequent to the pandemic, getting people to do things, even things like turn up for work and be paid, whether you work for a private company or a public company, has proved a really difficult task for many businesses and for the government itself, even with its own civil servants. So a lot, you've sown the seeds essentially of people disobeying rules, not caring, and nobody doing any of it. So. But on the question of Alexa says, should the Tories ally with reform? It's far too early to say. We don't even know yet what these remnants of Tories that do exist, who's going to lead them, what they're going to represent, who they are. We don't exactly know what form the 5 reform MPs are going, direction they're going to take in, what they're going to focus on, exactly how they're going to perform in Parliament and what they're going to do. And of course, another election is 5 years away, and if we know anything over the last period, 5 years is an eon, and one hell of a lot of stuff can happen in 5 years. So it's too early to say, to be honest. But I'm sure we're going to find out fairly soon. But the first thing that will happen will be a Tory leadership election. Rishi Sunak will be out, and somebody will lead them. One of their 121 MPs that are left will lead them. 120 if you don't count Rishi, because he's not getting the job again. So that will then decide what happens after that. But they've got to discover some principles as well. It's not just about who's in the top job. They've got to decide what they actually stand for, because at the moment their principleless action has led to their demise.
Yes, I think it would be quite an about face for Nigel Farage if he decided to merge with the Conservatives anyway, or form some kind of electoral pact, because he's been very emphatic about not liking the Conservatives, saying they're awful, they're the ones who have ruined the country, and so on. They've betrayed their promises, and so on. And the people who have come to reform largely seem to be people who are disaffected from the Conservatives, don't want to vote for the Conservatives anymore, so have come to reform. So I can't, in a sense, see why it would be in reform's interest to do that. Perhaps it might be in the Conservatives' interest, and although I don't know people particularly high up in the Conservatives, I'm friends with some people who are kind of on the lower levels, and actually, surprisingly, some of them, it's a bit mixed. Some of them seem enthusiastic about that, and some of them don't, which I was surprised about the enthusiasm that was there. But even for the Conservatives, I'm not sure whether it for them would seem to make sense, just in the sense that I would think for them to rebuild their kind of brand, they would want to kind of keep themselves, above it kind of thing. And I think it would be perceived as a kind of weakness maybe if they were reaching out to reform too much. So maybe they will, but I just, as you say, Richard, at this moment, I don't think we can really make a judgment. But I think it's unlikely, is what I'll say.
I
But
mean,
Razi, go
so
on, Mark.
but bear in mind that as I said earlier on, the Conservative Party is not being wiped out. You still have people around like Jeremy Hunt, Whittingdale, and of course, Lord Cameron is still there, pulling a strings if you want to. He's the guy who represents the Rishi side of the so-called conservative parties, which is not conservative at all. So I doubt that the next leader will be able to herd these kind of cats and try and recreate a consistent conservative, going back to more conservative policies and especially in economics, because the culture is just not there. They will have to go through such a hassle and such a fight, and as we mentioned earlier on, it was the politicians, the parliamentary party, the MPs, who didn't want the choice of the members of the Conservative Party. So it's going to be an uphill struggle for anyone to try and reform the Conservative Party towards an electable state, which might well take 10 years.
Razi?
So, yeah, back to will they will reform and the conservatives unite in some way? Look, first of all, Nigel Farage criticizing the conservatives does not mean he's not going to be a part of that party in the future. Nigel Farage, yesterday was the first time he was elected to parliament, the eighth time he ran. But so many of those times and so much of his political career is him saying that he's going to do something or not going to do something and then doing the opposite, including in this election. Very shortly before actually announcing that he's running, he said that he's not running because he wants to focus on helping Trump win the presidential election. So the fact that he's criticizing them definitely is not a reason to believe that he's not joining them under any circumstances. I think one thing that would be very attractive to Farage in joining the Conservative Party is the possibility of him being the leader, which I think is less of a remote possibility now than before, even though with 5 seats compared to 100 and whatever, they're not really going to be a force within that party. But with the number of votes they got, they could be a force. Now, people who always voted conservative and who either didn't vote this time or voted Reform or Labor or whatever out of protest, certainly out of protest, are not lost to the Conservative Party forever. They're lost to the Conservative Party that ran this time after 14 years in power. You have a lot of leeway in opposition. You can say a bunch of stuff, and then maybe you'll get the chance to back it up, and maybe not. So yeah, we decided on the title of this episode over a month ago, and at the time we thought the conservatives would have fewer seats than they have. So yeah,
Yeah.
I don't think that's a done deal. One other thing I wanted to comment on, Rishi, Marco, you mentioned that Rishi also says things and then changes his mind, which of course is true, is not unique to him, but maybe he's worse than others. I don't think he can change his mind, as in not follow through on policies like nationalizing the rail or the energy companies, because people remember that. In this country, people remember that. So the Liberal Democrats ran in 2010, and one of their promises was something to do with universities, not to raise university fees or something like that. And then they were in the coalition with the conservatives, and they were a minor party. Like their number was, I don't know what percentage it was, but it was like less than 20% maybe of the total seats. So they had to compromise on that to be a part of the coalition government. People remembered that for them 5 years later when it was time to vote again, and punished them for that in the polls. So Yeah, it will be difficult for Kier Starmer to justify not nationalizing the industries that he said he would, and then it would be difficult for him not to nationalize the industries he didn't say he would because again of the people in his party and the people controlling part of what they do behind the scenes.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention one thing on the Tories and Reform getting together. If you actually look at the number of votes that they got across the country, you get some interesting maths going on. So the Conservative got 6.8 million votes across the country, more or less, and Reform got 4.1 million. Now, if you add those two together, you get pretty much 11 million. Labour got 9.7 million votes. So, there is a split there. Of course, it's the system and where the votes pile up that affects why Labour gets such a large majority, despite that. But there is some interesting shifting plates going on here. I think one of the so I saw some figures explaining why the Conservatives went down in different groups, and I think this was particularly telling. Those areas that have high mortgages or people with lots of mortgages, they lost 24% of their normal voters in those areas, not least because after the Liz Truss period and the effect on markets and the effect on interest rates, some of which was caused, of course, by the pandemic anyway, and all that is one of the reasons for that. And of course, in Leave voting areas of the country that voted to leave the EU, where Leave got over 60% of the vote, the Conservative vote at this election went down by 27% in those areas because the Leave voting areas were frankly pissed off that the Conservatives had not done Brexit properly. They'd left in name alone and then chosen to change nothing subsequently. So yeah, there's that. And then just while I've got these figures in front of me, the last thing I wanted to mention was about the Muslim vote and Labour support. In high Muslim areas, the vote for Labour went down 23%. And that is to do with the Gaza policy, even despite Keir Starmer's mellowing of his position in their view on Gaza, and of course, despite seeing Angela Rayner, the deputy, begging male Muslim leaders to give her the vote and that she would look after their interests once she was deputy prime minister, which she now is.
Sorry, again, talking about the Muslim vote and Labour, there's actually quite an interesting seat here in London, in the northeast. Ian Duncan Smith, former Conservative Labour leader, he was nearly guaranteed to lose his seat. However, because the Labour Party decided to get rid of their established the previous candidate because she was a Corbynite, they decided to parachute another proper Labour centrist person there. So they effectively the former candidate who was kicked out effectively, she decided to stand as independent. She's supported by the Muslim vote and all that, and they ended up splitting the vote. So Ian Duncan Smith managed to take his seat with increased majority because the Labour vote was actually split by this thing, which is quite hilarious.
Did you see the announcement of that live or
No.
later on? I remember that. That was one of the more memorable ones of the night. I despise Ian Duncan Smith, but you could see the face of the woman who was the MP and was now independent, and she was like shaking her head, looking at the Labour candidate, basically blaming her for it was funny. If it wasn't Ian Duncan Smith, I would have enjoyed it a lot more.
Yeah, the same woman actually, she's a piece of work because in 2019 when she lost as a proper Labour candidate against Ian Duncan Smith, she then tweeted something like, "This is an injustice. We're gonna send the boys around." So she was a bit threatening as well. So that's not the kind of person you want on your side.
And she was kicked out for liking anti-Semitic tweets and stuff. That's why Corbyn chose to get rid of her. Although I suspect a big part why Starmer chose to get rid of her, and I suspect a big part of that was also that she was a strong Corbynite, and it was better to not to have her kind of voice to deal with afterwards. So let's lose a seat and we don't really need and worry about it later.
Yeah, I don't know much about her. Actually, I don't know anything about her, but just from seeing her on that stage, she seemed like a very unpleasant human being, which of course is why she's in politics. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to ask you guys. I mean, we're talking about the obituary of the Conservative Party, and I mean, some of the polling had put them at potentially doing even worse than they have. I think there was one that put them at something like 67 seats a few days ago, which was kind of, unbelievably bad. That was, extinction kind of event for them. And they haven't done quite as bad as that, although they have done very poorly. And I don't know, what do you think the future of the Conservative Party is? I mean, because the way it seems now is it seems like 1997, they've done very poorly, but they're probably going to, put themselves back together, limp kind of onwards. And when the Labour Party starts annoying people, they'll probably sort of claw their way back to larger seat shares and then perhaps their government in the future. Do you think that's possible, or do you think this is really it for them? And or what do you think?
Well,
Go on.
yeah.
Well, I think they'll bounce back at some point. Whether they should or not will depend. A change of leader will bring a fresh face and all that, and people will suddenly treat them differently, even if nothing behind the scenes has changed. And of course, Keir Starmer himself is as dull as ditch water. And that's going to be very quickly apparent already in his acceptance speech outside Number 10. It was the most boring speech you've ever seen, delivered really, really dully. It was peppered with words that we're going to hear an awful lot in the future. He must have said the word service about 25 times in this 3-minute speech. He used words like sacrifice, and we would need to teach people that politics can be a force for good, and all that kind of stuff. And that's going to become wearing for a country that also has a considerable amount of people who aren't sold up necessarily to that, even if they've flicked the bird at this election towards the Conservatives.
Mm.
Yeah, it's not 1997. There isn't the enthusiasm and frankly the ability on the Labour Party side of that they had at that point, that people able to push things through, and yet they don't even have the will to do it. As Richard mentioned, we're interested in philosophy. Just listen to that Number 10 speech, the first speech, talking about suffering, service, all this kind of crap. And as you mentioned yourself, Morgan, even the fact he already mentions, "Oh, don't expect me to stick to a policy. I'm going to have you to turn left, right, and center." He's already preparing the ground for capitulation left, right, and center. So I don't think it's going to be an impossible task for the Tories. But then again, they screwed up so badly in the last 40 minutes that they didn't show any political acumen at all. They could have wiped out the Labour Party just on the Israeli Gaza issue. They could have just caused the Labour Party collapse. They didn't capitalize on it. They were totally unable to deal with stuff. So who knows?
Well, unlike Morgan, I wasn't in the cradle in 2001. I believe that was the first time I watched the British election live. That was William Hague, right? They didn't bounce back at all. They maybe won a few more seats than before, but they lost spectacularly. It took them 13 years after the 97 election to come back to power, and I think they kind of did okay in 2005. Okay, but lost. I mean, okay compared to the previous three attempts or two attempts. So I think they have a better chance of bouncing back quicker now. Uh, Mostly because, yeah, Marco, as you mentioned, Keir Starmer is no Tony Blair, and no, I'm not saying that because I'm a Blairite. I'm saying that because just Tony Blair won much more because of who he was than because of who he wasn't. Whereas Starmer, the personality that won it for Starmer was the personality of Rishi Sunak, if anything. So I think with him gone and with whoever, well, it depends who takes over the Conservative Party. Maybe I'm sure we'll talk about that at some point because Kemi Badenoch seems as good as it gets. Suella Braverman, I think, is not popular with the general public, in part because the Rwanda policy is very much associated with her. So can they bounce back? Yeah, in the same way that if you had asked me after Brexit, can they make a good thing out of this? Yeah, they could have. They just chose not to. So I think that all remains to be seen. I wanted to just also quickly touch on a couple of other points that were made. Conservatives losing voters in areas where people voted Leave. many of those areas became conservative just for one election cycle, and there were labor places that voted for Boris because they wanted Brexit, and they probably wanted Brexit because they didn't want foreigners stealing their jobs for the most part. So, they again wanted a good thing for bad reasons, and they got what they wanted. And yeah, anybody after last night's election who is not terrified by the Muslim vote is not paying attention. This is yeah, the Muslim vote went with Hamas very, very clearly, and we
Yeah.
should pay attention.
Sorry, Rosie, I don't know whether you saw the result in Finchley. That went to Labour, which is disheartening because if the Jewish population in London thinks that just by voting Labour you're voting for a different party, you're gonna be sorely, sorely disappointed. And you should have done your due process on that one because you're gonna come to regret that vote. But
Yeah, there are a couple of high Jewish seats, Hendon being one of them, which was won just by 15 votes, very slim majority, and Finchley another one. And what the Labour Party did there is essentially put a Jewish candidate up for Labour in that seat and managed to win it for Labour on that basis. But if you think that means just because the candidate is Jewish and has expressed different views on Gaza, that the policy of the Labour Party is going to change towards Gaza or not be a pro-Palestinian one within a matter of even more obviously in a matter of weeks, then it's going to be a rude awakening.
Yeah, that's another thing that I would blame the conservatives. I mean, to lose Margaret Thatcher's seat to yeah, it's and after October 7th is really, you really have to be terrible, and they were. Let me just quickly read the super chat. Thank you, Frank. Frank asks, does labor and power mean more climate change vandalism? I don't know. It could, because first of all, to the left, this is how the people express their views. This is a legitimate way. With the conservatives, you got a little bit of lip service to actually enforcing the law when it comes to people breaking it, but saying it's for a good cause. With labor, I think you'll get less of that, and you definitely won't get immediately much more disastrous energy policies. You'll get slowly getting worse and worse policies that we'll pay for, but they're not going to be as quick as the Gretas of the world would like to see, and her followers, yeah, will not. They're not nice people, and they're not going to pretend to be.
And one of the major donors for Just Stop Oil is also a major donor for the Labour Party and switch its allegiance. So I think you're definitely going to see more climate change vandalism and fewer licenses for drilling for oil, etc.
Morgan.
I don't have too much else to say. I'm not certainly Labour seems, more favourable towards the climate change policies like this. So I think we can expect that. I think, you were talking about the Conservatives losing Margaret Thatcher's old seat. I mean, just the number of safe seats the Conservatives managed to lose at this election has just been, shocking, really. I mean, and not just safe seats, but safe seats in which there are kind of big name MPs, which and government ministers, who you would think maybe would be more likely to win them, but huge majorities being lost. I mean, the fact that again, Jacob Rees-Mogg lost his seat. I mean, Liz Truss lost her seat. Maybe that seems likely, but the seats where they're losing in us are seats they've never voted Labour in their lives, and now have done, and that's a really big change. And I think that's one of the really kind of shocking things at this election.
Well, if Labour doesn't get rid of the internet by tomorrow, we will be back with the Daily Objective, and we will be talking about something that's been in the news in Israel in the last couple of days, which is an incident where a, a couple of I think soldiers went, but were not officially on duty at the time. On October 7th, went south, picked up guns of dead soldiers, joined the fighting. At some point, got a terrorist, apprehended him, and allegedly executed him. So we're gonna talk about that, and here you'll hear a view here. I think at least one view here that you won't hear elsewhere about this. We also have Sunday's topic, but I forget what it is, but it's a good one, I'm sure. And yeah, and again, if we can, for as long as we can do this, we will keep doing it. Uh, thanks, guys. Morgan, where can people find more from you?
You can follow me on Twitter at MorganCarter98, which will be linked in the description.
Marco Richard.
Check out the Briefly Objective for shorter content with visuals to it down below where it says for shorter content.
And I'm Razi Ginsburg on X. My tweets from last night, from during the election results, are still up, just like Jeremy Corbyn's tweet from October 17th, claiming that Israel bombed the Al Ali hospital and killed 500 innocent Palestinians, is still up. I stand by my tweets, and I'm sure Corbyn stands by his. But he is a legislator in this country, an elected member of parliament. And I am not, and I'm not running either, but I think it says something about the culture. We're going to say a lot about the culture every day on this channel. Thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you tomorrow.
Bye.